The letter had been written for a man named Owen Townsend, but Eva Langston had only ever heard that name spoken once whispered by her dying father in the lamplight of a Kansas City boarding house, pressed into her palm like a secret worth more than gold. It was the autumn of 1879, and Eva had exactly $4.32 to her name, a carpetbag containing 2 dresses and a Bible, and a one-way train ticket to a town called Harrow Creek in the New Mexico Territory. She was 22 years old, brown-haired and steady-eyed, the kind of woman who did not cry in front of strangers, though she had cried plenty in private. Her father, Harding Langston, had died of fever 3 weeks prior, and in the final hours of his lucid mind, he had pressed a folded letter into her hand and told her to find Owen Townsend of Harrow Creek, that Owen was a good man, a solid man, a man who would see her right. He had not told her Owen was a rancher. He had not told her Owen had brothers. He had not told her that when she stepped off the southbound train at Harrow Creek's barely there platform, with the dust swirling around her ankles and the October sun splitting everything into gold and shadow, 3 tall men would be standing there watching her with identical dark eyes and nearly identical faces, each of them wearing a different expression of complete surprise. Eva stood on that platform with her carpetbag in both hands and looked at the 3 of them. They looked back at her. The train behind her exhaled a great gust of steam and then rattled away south, and the silence that settled over Harrow Creek's single-street town felt enormous and strange. "I am looking for Owen Townsend," she said, because there was nothing else to say. The 3 men exchanged a look so fast and so loaded with meaning that Eva nearly missed it. The tallest one, broad-shouldered and weathered in a way that suggested years spent outdoors without complaint, pushed back the brim of his hat. The middle one, slightly leaner, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved with strong opinions, crossed his arms. The youngest, who could not have been more than 23 or 24 himself, looked briefly at his boots. "That would be all 3 of us," the tallest one said, and the way he said it was careful, like a man walking across a floor he wasn't sure would hold him. Eva blinked. "I beg your pardon. Owen is our family name," the lean one said. "Nate Townsend," he nodded at the tallest. "That is Cole Townsend," he nodded at the youngest. "And that is Seth Townsend. We are all Owens, technically, if you're going by middle names. Our father had a habit of giving all his sons the same middle name." Eva stared at them. "Your father named all 3 of you Owen. Owen Nathaniel, Owen Coleman, Owen Seth." The youngest Seth had looked up from his boots now. He had a softer face than the other 2, though he held himself with the same rancher's posture. "We never much used the first part, but on paper, yes, ma'am. We are all Owen Townsend." Eva felt the particular sensation of the ground tilting slightly beneath her that had nothing to do with physical movement. Her father's letter, which she had read so many times she could have recited it, had simply said, "Find Owen Townsend in Harrow Creek, New Mexico Territory. He will do right by you. Trust him. He is the best kind of man I have ever known." It had not specified which one. "I see," she said, though she did not entirely see. Cole, the tallest, had already reached for her carpetbag. "Come on then. Standing here on the platform won't sort anything out. We've got a wagon." The Townsend Ranch was 4 miles outside of Harrow Creek, situated between low red hills and a dry creek bed that ran with water only in the spring. Eva sat in the wagon bed while the 3 brothers occupied the bench and drove in a silence that was not unfriendly but was very clearly occupied. They were thinking hard about something. She could feel it. The ranch itself was a proper working operation. A main house built of adobe and timber, a large barn, 2 smaller outbuildings, and a set of corrals holding perhaps 30 horses. Cattle dotted the hillside beyond. It was not wealthy exactly, but it was solid and maintained, the kind of place built by people who intended to stay. A woman came out of the main house as the wagon pulled up, older, white-haired, sharp-eyed in the way of someone who had seen a great deal and discarded most of it. She looked at Eva in the wagon and then looked at her 3 sons with an expression that was equal parts exasperation and unsurprise. "Mama," Cole said, swinging down. "This is Eva Langston." She came in on the southbound. "She is looking for Owen Townsend." "Is she?" said the woman. She studied Eva with direct, assessing eyes. "I am Margaret Townsend. Get down from that wagon, child. You look like you have been on that train for 3 days." 2.5, Eva admitted, climbing down. Her legs were stiff and the dust of the yard settled around her like a fine second skin. Margaret Townsend looked at her 3 sons with the kind of look that made all 3 of them find things to do with their hats. "Come inside," she said to Eva. "I will make coffee and you can tell me who sent you." The inside of the house was clean and smelled of wood smoke and pine tar soap. Margaret sat Eva down at a wide kitchen table and produced coffee and corn bread in a matter of minutes. And Eva, who had not eaten since a biscuit at the last train stop, ate with more gratitude than she showed. She explained between bites about her father. Harding Langston had been a traveling man in his younger years, a surveyor, then a cattle buyer, then a man who did various things for various people across a large stretch of territory. He had known the Townsend family, apparently, though he had never told Eva the details. He had died saying that Owen Townsend would help her, that she should not be afraid to ask. Margaret listened to all of this with her hands folded on the table, and her expression unreadable. When Eva finished, the older woman looked at the kitchen doorway where all 3 of her sons had drifted to lean in quiet succession, trying not to appear as though they were listening. "Harding Langston," Margaret said, in a tone that suggested the name meant something to her. "You knew him?" Eva asked. "I knew of him. My late husband spoke well of him." She looked at her sons again. "Your father owed Harding Langston a debt, a significant one." She paused. "It appears he has sent his daughter to collect it." The debt, as it unfolded over the course of that evening, was of the kind that could not be repaid in money. Harding Langston had, many years ago, spoken on behalf of the Townsend patriarch in a legal dispute over land title that would have cost the family their entire ranch. His testimony had been the difference between the Townsends keeping everything and losing it all. He had never asked for repayment. Now, apparently, through the medium of his daughter and a single name on a letter, he had. The question was simply, which Owen? None of the brothers said it directly, but Eva was not a foolish woman. She understood what was hanging in the air of that kitchen. Her father had sent her here either to marry or to be cared for, possibly both, possibly neither, depending on what kind of man Owen Townsend turned out to be. But there were 3 of them, and not one of them was stepping forward to claim the name her father had given her. "You can sleep in the back room tonight," Margaret said firmly, in a way that closed the subject of which Owen for the time being. "The rest will sort itself out in the morning, as things tend to." Eva was given a room at the back of the house, small and cleanly furnished, with a window that looked out over the corrals and the dark silhouette of the hills beyond. She lay on top of the quilt in her traveling dress and stared at the ceiling and thought about her father, about the strange arrangement she had stepped into, and about the 3 men who had watched her come into their yard with varying degrees of wariness and interest. She fell asleep before she had made any conclusions, which was perhaps the wisest thing she could have done. Morning in the territory came early and loud. Eva woke to roosters and the sound of a horse being worked in the corral, and the smell of frying salt pork drifting under her door. She washed her face in the basin provided, changed into her second and better dress, and followed the smell to the kitchen, where she found not Margaret but Seth Townsend, the youngest brother, standing at the stove with a pan in his hand and an expression of intense concentration. He looked up when she came in and immediately reddened slightly around the ears. "Morning," he said. "Mama went out early. I told her I could handle breakfast." "It smells good," Eva said honestly, and sat at the table. Seth brought a plate over and then stood with his own plate at the counter, apparently unable to decide whether to join her at the table or not. Eva solved the problem by nodding at the chair across from her, and he sat, though he ate quickly, and with the manner of a man who expected to be called elsewhere at any moment. He was good-looking, she thought, in the uncomplicated way of young men who spent all their time outdoors and thought very little about it. He had dark eyes and dark hair, and a scatter of freckles across his nose that made him look younger than his years. He was 24, she learned in the conversation that followed, the youngest of the three brothers by 6 years. Cole was 32. Nate was 28. 32, Eva said. He seems older. Cole has always seemed older than he is, Seth agreed. He started running the ranch when he was 19. After Papa died, he paused. He has been running it ever since. And Nate runs the cattle operation. He is good with cattle, better than Cole, though Cole would not say so. Seth ate a piece of corn bread with some thought. Nate is also the one who reads the most. He has a whole shelf of books in his room. He orders them from a bookseller in Santa Fe. Eva found that interesting but said nothing. What about you? She asked instead. Seth was quiet for a moment. I handle the horses. We breed them, mostly working horses, some for the army contract. I have a good eye for horses. He said this simply, without pride and without false modesty, in the way of someone stating a plain fact. Eva respected that. The morning passed in observation. Eva was not the kind of woman to sit in a room when she could be useful, and Margaret, returning from whatever early errand had occupied her, seemed to understand this without being told. She set Eva to tasks without apology and without excessive direction, and Eva completed them without complaint, and by midday there was an understanding between them that did not require words. Cole came in for the noon meal still wearing his work clothes and bringing the smell of horses with him. He sat at the table and ate with deliberate efficiency, and spoke when spoken to, and watched Eva with those dark eyes in a way that was neither rude nor warm but simply measuring, like a man who made all his assessments slowly and carefully, and did not reverse them easily. Nate came in late, his shirt dusty, carrying a folded newspaper from the stack he apparently kept in the barn for reading during his midday rest. He sat and ate and read simultaneously, which Margaret tolerated with the patience of long practice. It was Nate who spoke to Eva at length first, and he did it in the afternoon when she was sitting on the porch shelling beans and he came to lean against the post with a mug of coffee. "You are not what I expected," he said. "You expected someone?" Eva asked, not looking up from the beans. "We received a letter," he said, 2 weeks ago, from a lawyer in Kansas City. It said that Harding Langston had died and that his daughter would be coming to Harrow Creek to present herself to Owen Townsend, as per an arrangement of long standing. He paused. It did not explain what arrangement. Eva looked up. "He didn't tell me either, just the name. How did you feel about that?" "I was not best pleased," she said honestly, "but he was my father and he was dying and I did not have much else in the way of options." Nate was quiet for a moment, looking out over the yard. "The thing is," he said carefully, "Cole received that letter, and Cole did not say a word to Nate or to me about it until the day you arrived." Eva considered this. "Why would he do that?" "That," said Nate, "is a very good question." She thought about that conversation through the rest of the afternoon and into the evening, turning it over the way you turn a river stone, looking at the different faces of it. Cole had known she was coming. Cole had not told his brothers. He had let them all go to the train platform together, had let them all be equally surprised when she climbed down with her carpetbag, and had said nothing to explain the situation. That evening, after supper, when Seth had gone to the barn to check on a mare that was close to foaling and Nate had taken himself off with his newspaper, Eva found herself alone on the porch with Cole. The night was coming on cool and enormous, the kind of sky that the territory did well, full of stars from one horizon to the other. "Nate told me about the lawyer's letter," she said. Cole, who was sitting on the steps whittling something, did not stop whittling. "Did he?" "He said you knew I was coming and did not tell them." "That's accurate." "Why?" Cole was quiet for a long time, long enough that Eva thought he might simply choose not to answer. Then he set down the whittling and looked at her with those steady, measuring dark eyes. "Because I was not sure what you were coming for," he said, "and I did not want my brothers making assumptions before they met you." "What kind of assumptions?" "The kind that would make them feel obligated," he said. "Seth especially." He feels things strongly, and he acts on them before he thinks. I did not want him feeling like he owed you something before he had a chance to decide for himself how he felt." Eva looked at him. "And Nate would have had opinions," Cole said. There was something very slightly warmer in his voice when he said this, a sibling's affectionate irritation. "What about you?" Eva asked. "Did you have opinions?" Cole looked back at the yard. "I had the letter," he said. "I had the arrangement. I knew what your father intended." He paused. "I have been running this ranch for 13 years. I know what it means to honor a debt. Your father saved everything my father built. What happens to you matters to me." He said the last sentence quietly, with a weight that had nothing performative about it. Eva sat with that for a moment. "That is very straightforward," she said. "I am a straightforward man," he said. She almost smiled. Apparently. The days that followed settled into a kind of routine that Eva had not expected to find comfortable, but did. She was useful in the house and in the kitchen, and Margaret was a businesslike teacher who showed her the rhythms of the ranch's domestic operation without condescension. The territory was vast and strange and beautiful in ways that Kansas City had never been. All open air and red rock and enormous weather. And Eva found, to her own surprise, that she was breathing more deeply here than she had in years. She was also paying attention to the three brothers, because she was a sensible woman and her situation required it. Seth was easy to be around. He had an openness to him, a genuine willingness to share his thoughts, and he laughed easily at small things. He took her to the corral one morning to show her the new foal, a blood bay filly, thin-legged and perfect, who regarded Eva with enormous dark eyes and then pressed her soft nose against Eva's palm. Seth watched her face when she touched the foal and looked quietly pleased, as though her delight confirmed something he had hoped. Nate was more interesting in a different way. He was serious but not severe, the way of men who spend a great deal of time with their own thoughts. He lent her a book, a collection of essays by a man named Ralph Waldo Emerson, and then watched her read it without comment and brought her a second one the following week. He asked her opinion on things. He liked to argue ideas in the mild way of someone who disagreed more for the pleasure of thinking than for any desire to win. He told her once about his plan to expand the cattle operation south toward the Cimarron River, spreading a hand-drawn map on the kitchen table, and explaining it with a kind of restrained enthusiasm that was like watching fire behind glass. Cole she knew least, because Cole was the most contained. He was always there at meals at the end of the day in the yard or the barn, but he spoke less than the others and watched more. She caught him watching her sometimes when he thought she was not looking, with an expression she could not read. It was not unfriendly. It was not cold. It was simply very careful and very attentive, and it made her feel simultaneously seen and uncertain. The town of Harrow Creek came to know her existence within the week, as small towns do. She went with Margaret to the mercantile on the first Friday of her stay, and the proprietor's wife, a Mrs. Halbert, greeted her with the aggressive friendliness of a woman who intended to gather all available information as quickly as possible. "You are the young woman staying with the Townsend boys," Mrs. Halbert said, in a tone that made the word staying do a great deal of work. "I am Eva Langston," Eva said. "I am a guest of the family." Mrs. Halbert's eyes moved to Margaret, who returned her look with the absolute serenity of a woman who did not give anyone anything they were not entitled to. On the way home in the wagon, Eva asked Margaret the question she had been building toward. "Did your husband really intend for me to marry one of your sons?" Margaret drove in silence for a moment. The desert road ahead of them ran straight and pale between the scrubland, and a hawk was turning in slow circles far overhead. "Your father and my husband were friends," Margaret said at last. "Not the kind of friends who saw each other often, the kind who had known each other in important circumstances and never forgot it. When your father wrote to my husband years ago to say he had a daughter and little else to leave her, my husband wrote back and said, 'Send her to us whenever the time comes. Owen will see her right.'" She paused. My husband had the habit of calling all three of his sons by that name when he meant any of them. He never specified which one. Eva absorbed this. And you? And I? Margaret glanced at her sideways. What do you think should happen? Margaret looked back at the road. I think, she said slowly, that my sons are good men who have not given themselves enough reason to be happy. I think you are a capable and clear-eyed young woman in need of a solid foundation. I think what should happen is whatever it is that you and whichever of my sons happens to find each other. She paused again. I have no preference in the matter. They are all good men. But they are different good men, and only one of them is the right kind of good for you specifically. Eva said nothing, because she had nothing yet to say. 2 weeks into her stay, something happened that shifted the quiet dynamic of the ranch. A man rode in on a lathered horse late on a Tuesday afternoon. One of the hands from a neighbor's spread 15 miles south, with word that a small group of cattle thieves had been working the range between Harrow Creek and the southern hills. 2 of the Townsend steers had apparently been taken, along with several from neighboring ranches. The local deputy, a young man named Arvid Cruz who was more enthusiastic than experienced, was organizing a party to ride out and recover what could be recovered. Cole and Nate went. Seth stayed not from cowardice, but because Margaret put her foot down and said someone had to run the ranch, and Seth was the one who did not argue with Margaret. Eva watched Cole and Nate ride out in the low golden light of late afternoon, their horses moving easily into the scrubland, and felt a tight knot of worry that surprised her with its intensity. Seth found her at the fence. They will be fine, he said. You sound certain. Cole has done this before. He knows the range better than anyone. Seth rested his elbows on the fence rail. Nate is careful. Between the 2 of them, they will not do anything foolish. And Deputy Cruz. Seth made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Cruz is enthusiastic, he allowed. They stayed at the fence in the fading light, and Seth told her stories about Cole and Nate, about growing up on this ranch with these 2 older brothers who had been both his guardians and his tormentors in the loving way of older brothers everywhere. He told her about the summer Cole had spent 3 days looking for Seth after Seth had, at age 9, decided to walk to a neighboring ranch because he had heard they had a black stallion and needed to see it for himself. He told her about Nate's bookshelf, which had required an entire afternoon to build and which collapsed once during an earthquake, and which Nate had rebuilt overnight so that no one would see him upset about it. Eva laughed, genuinely, for the first time since she had arrived, and Seth looked at her with quiet pleasure. Cole and Nate returned the following day at mid-morning with 2 Townsend steers, and the information that the thieves had been a pair of desperate men from across the territorial border, already known to the local law, who were now in Deputy Cruz's custody and would be transported to the county seat. There had been no real violence. Everyone was intact. Nate came in for breakfast looking tired and cheerful in equal measure. Cole came in looking only tired, but when he saw that Eva had held back a portion of the hot breakfast for their return, something moved briefly across his face that was neither tired nor careful. He looked at her for one long moment over his coffee cup and then looked away, and Eva felt the back of her neck warm. That evening, Margaret announced at supper that the Halbert family was hosting a social dance at their barn on Saturday evening, and that the Townsend family was expected to attend as they always did. All of us? Seth asked, with the tone of a man who found barn dances pleasant but socially taxing. All of you, Margaret said, and Eva as well, if she is willing. Eva, who had not attended a social gathering of any kind since her father had begun to decline, said that she was willing. The social was a proper affair by Harrow Creek standards, which meant half the territory had come. The Halbert barn was strung with paper lanterns and smelled of pine resin and sawdust and the various perfumes of women who had dressed carefully. A fiddle and a guitar were already playing when the Townsend wagon arrived, a fast, sweet tune that made Eva's feet want to move before she had even climbed down. Seth helped her down from the wagon with a hand that held hers a beat longer than strictly necessary, and smiled at her with uncomplicated warmth. Nate offered her his arm to walk in, and she took it, and he talked to her about the music, explaining, in his mild, bookish way, the differences between the fiddle styles of the region, which apparently varied by the background of the player in ways Eva had never thought to consider. Cole walked ahead of them both and said nothing, but when they had been inside for perhaps 20 minutes and a man from the other side of the room, a stocky, loud-voiced rancher named Birch came over and asked Eva to dance with a directness that bordered on presumption. It was Cole who materialized quietly beside her. "She's with us," Cole said. Nothing more. Birch looked at Cole and decided not to argue. Eva turned to look at Cole, who met her eyes with a steady, impassive expression that gave nothing away. "I could have handled that," she said quietly. "I know," he said. "Then why?" "Because you shouldn't have to," he said simply, and then he offered her his hand. "Will you dance?" She had not expected it from him, had expected, somehow, that Cole would be the kind of man who stood at the edge of dances rather than participated. But he danced the way he did everything, with complete attention and very little waste of movement. He was a better dancer than she expected, holding her properly, turning her through the figures of the reel with a quiet confidence that made it easy to follow. When the music stopped, he stepped back and let her go and said nothing. But the careful, measuring look he gave her then was different from all the previous careful, measuring looks. There was something else in it. She thought about it all the way home in the wagon under that ocean of stars. 2 days after the social, Seth asked her if she would ride with him to look at a piece of rangeland to the north where he was thinking about putting a new paddock. She agreed, and Margaret lent her a serviceable old mare, and they rode out in the cool morning air with Seth pointing out landmarks and telling her the history of the various pieces of land, as though she were someone he expected to need to know these things for a long time. At the ridge, overlooking a sweep of valley below, Seth pulled up his horse and looked out for a long moment. Then he said, without preamble and with the directness of someone who had been building toward it for some time, "I like you, Eva, I like you considerably." Eva looked at him. He was looking at the valley, not at her, but his jaw was set in the way she had come to recognize as his version of courage. "I like you as well, Seth," she said carefully. "I know you came here for a reason," he said. "I know it is not entirely simple. But I want you to know that whatever that reason is, my feeling toward you is not about the debt or the arrangement or any of that. It is just about you." He paused. "I am not very good at saying this kind of thing." "You are doing fine," she said gently. He looked at her then. "I just wanted you to know," he said. "You do not have to say anything." She didn't say anything, and he seemed to accept that, and they rode back in a companionable silence that held warmth in it even without words. That evening, Nate found her reading on the porch and sat across from her in the other chair and said, in his careful, considered way, "I want to be honest with you about something." "All right," Eva said, closing the book. "When you first arrived," Nate said, "I told myself I was observing you with detachment, trying to understand the situation clearly." He paused. "I no longer believe that is what I was doing." Eva waited. "I think about what you say after you say it," Nate continued. "About the Emerson essays and the things you found in them. About the way you handled Mrs. Halbert at the mercantile. About the way you talk with Mama." He looked at his hands. "I find that I am looking for excuses to be where you are. I am aware that is not entirely appropriate given the circumstances. The circumstances being that your 2 brothers are also—" "Yes," he said quietly, "those circumstances." Eva looked at him for a long moment. Nate met her eyes, and in his she saw a quality she had come to associate with him, a kind of careful, restrained intensity, like a man who felt things deeply and spent a great deal of energy not showing it. "Nate," she said, "I appreciate you telling me." "I am not asking you for anything," he said. "I just did not want to pretend." She nodded slowly. She liked that about him, she thought, the honesty of it. That night she lay in her small room and looked at the ceiling and thought about what her situation actually was. She had come here with a name and nothing else. She had found 3 men who shared that name and who were all, in their different ways, remarkable. who was warm and open and who looked at her like she was the best part of his day. Nate, who was thoughtful and careful and who engaged her mind like no one had in years. And Cole, who said less than either of his brothers but who she found herself watching without meaning to, who had danced with her in that barn like it was the most natural thing in the world, who had built the weight of 13 years of responsibility into his bearing like a stone wall that she somehow wanted to see all the way through. She thought about what Margaret had said. Only one of them is the right kind of good for you specifically. She thought about Cole's hand in hers during the reel. The way it had been unhurried. The way he had held her properly, solidly, not too tight and not too loose, as though he had already decided on the exact right amount of everything. She fell asleep thinking about it and woke up already knowing, in some deep, quiet part of herself, what she felt. But knowing was one thing, and doing anything about it was another, and she had been raised to be careful with other people's hearts. The next morning she went to find Cole. He was in the barn, repairing a section of harness with the focused patience of a man who was accustomed to fixing things. He looked up when she came in but didn't stop working. "I need to talk to you," she said. "All right," he said. She sat on a hay bale and looked at him. He set down the harness after a moment and gave her his full attention, which with Cole meant he simply turned and was still and waited. "Your brothers have both told me how they feel," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "Did they tell you?" "Seth told me, Nate, I could see." Cole looked at the harness. "They are both good men." "They are," Eva agreed. "They are." She waited. Cole looked at her again. "Are you going to tell me how you feel?" she asked. Something moved through his expression, not quite surprise, but something adjacent. "I was not sure you were asking." "I am asking." He was quiet for so long that she began to think she had miscalculated entirely. Then he said, in a voice that was quieter than his usual, the careful quality stripped back from it in a way that made it sound new. "I knew what you were coming for before you arrived. I knew about the arrangement, about your father, about all of it. And I told myself I would see to it that you were taken care of, whichever of us ended up being right for you. That was my intention. And now," she said, "and now I have spent 3 weeks watching you shell beans and gentle horses, and argue ideas with Nate and make my brother laugh," he said. "Watching you hold yourself together in a place that is entirely strange to you, with nothing but your own good sense and your father's letter." He paused. "I have not once thought about what my intention was. I have thought about you." Eva looked at him. The barn light came through the high windows in long, pale bars, and Cole Townsend was standing in one of them, hat off, looking at her with those steady dark eyes from which all the careful measurement had gone, and what remained was just plainness, honesty. A kind of quiet want that she recognized because she felt it too. "The night we danced," she said, "you held my hand for a moment after the music stopped." "I did," he said. "Was that an intention?" The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was the nearest thing to one she had seen on Cole Townsend's face. "That was not an intention," he said. "That was entirely against my intentions." She stood up from the hay bale and crossed the barn to where he was standing, and stopped in front of him close enough that she had to look up slightly to meet his eyes, and said, "I think my father knew which Owen he was sending me to. I think he knew this ranch, and he knew your father, and he had a very particular idea." "I think so too," Cole said very quietly. "He just didn't tell me," she said. "He left me to figure it out." "Smart man," Cole said. She laughed then, a real, full, surprised laugh, and the corner of Cole's mouth moved again, and this time it became an actual smile, slow and complete, and it changed his whole face, and she thought, "There it is, the thing I have been looking for through all that stillness." He reached out and took her hand, the way he had in the dance, unhurried and exactly right, and she let him, and they stood in the barn light with their hands linked, and the horses moving quietly in their stalls, and it was the simplest and most complete thing that had happened to Eva Langston in all her 22 years. The matter of Seth and Nate was harder, and Eva did not pretend it wasn't. She told Seth first, because she thought his openness would make the conversation quicker, and she was right in that it made it faster, but not in the way she had expected. Seth listened to her with his eyes on the ground, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment, and then he looked up and there was something in his face that was real pain, genuine and unperformed. "Cole," he said. "Yes," she said. He nodded, slowly, multiple times, in the manner of someone processing something they had known was possible but still found hard. "Cole deserves good things," he said finally. "He has given his whole life to this ranch, to us. He has not taken much for himself." He paused. "If it was going to be one of us, I am glad it is Cole." "Seth, I mean it," he said, and looked at her with those honest dark eyes. "I will not pretend it does not hurt, but I mean it." She thanked him, sincerely and without condescension, and he nodded again and went back to his horses, and she let him go. Nate took it differently. He was at the corral fence with his coffee when she found him, and he listened to her with his characteristic stillness, and when she finished, he said nothing for a long moment. "He did not tell me," Nate said at last. "He did not know how to," Eva said honestly. "He was not sure it was his to say until I made it clear." "Of course he wasn't," Nate said, with a complicated expression that contained both frustration and something like rueful affection. Cole would wait until he was entirely certain before he said a word about any of it. He paused. "Did he say it clearly?" "He did," Eva said. Nate looked out at the hills. Then he said, carefully and deliberately, "You are certain?" "I am," he nodded. He drank the rest of his coffee in a considered silence, and then he looked at her with a directness that did not hide anything. "He is a good man," he said. "The best of us in the ways that matter most. I hope you will both be happy." She believed him, and that made it easier. The months that followed were a particular kind of time that Eva would remember all her life as one of the most vivid and formative stretches of her existence. The ranch became familiar, and then beloved, the way places become beloved when you invest yourself in them. Margaret was a steady and unsentimental guide through the territory's domestic and social life. Seth recovered from his bruised heart with the resilience of the young, and began, by Christmas, to be seen more frequently in the company of a girl named Clara Reardon, whose father ran the feed store in Harrow Creek, and who laughed at Seth's stories with a genuineness that clearly delighted him. Nate put his energy into his maps and his cattle plans and his books, and seemed, after the initial difficulty, to find a settled contentment in Eva and Cole's growing attachment that was part approval and part relief. And Cole was a revelation. It was not that he transformed. He was still contained, still deliberate, still the kind of man who chose silences over words when silences served. But within the territory of what they were becoming to each other, he was different. He brought her things, not as gestures of courtship in the formal sense, but as simple acts of sharing. A hawk feather he had found on the trail, a piece of interesting quartz from the hillside, a paragraph from an almanac he thought she would find useful. He told her about the ranch in the detailed way of someone showing you the inside of something they have built with their hands, not to impress but to include. He asked her questions, and listened to the answers with a quality of attention that made her feel like her thoughts were worth the space they took up. One evening in late November, sitting on the porch steps with the cold air coming down from the hills and the stars enormous overhead, Cole said, "I want you to stay." Eva, who had been thinking about exactly this, said, "I know. I want to make it proper," he said, "if you are willing." "Are you asking me to marry you, Cole Townsend?" He looked at her. "I am asking you to consider it." She considered it for approximately 3 seconds. "Yes," she said. He reached for her hand again, the way he had in the barn, and held it, and looked out at the stars, and the warmth that came off him in that moment was not the warmth of speeches or declarations. It was the warmth of a man who had been holding himself very carefully for a very long time and had finally set something down. Margaret, when told, said, "Good, that took longer than necessary," Seth said. "About time," and then whooped and slapped Cole on the shoulder with a crack that made Cole wince. Nate shook Cole's hand seriously and then looked at Eva for a moment with those careful eyes and said, "He is a better man for knowing you. I hope you know that." Eva squeezed his hand and thanked him, and thought that Nate Townsend was one of the finer people she had ever known, even in the pain of it. They were married in the spring, in March of 1880, at the small Presbyterian church in Harrow Creek. It was not a large wedding in the formal sense. The church held 30-odd people and was filled. Margaret sat in the front pew and did not cry but pressed her handkerchief against her mouth once and then folded it away. Seth stood up for Cole, broad and beaming, in a good dark coat he had borrowed from Nate. Clara Reardon sat beside him, and he reached for her hand at some point during the vows, and she let him take it without comment. Nate read a passage from Scripture in a careful, clear voice, and then sat down and looked at his brother standing at the front of the church with Eva, and his expression was something that Eva, glancing over her shoulder at him, would think about later. Not loss, not quite, but a kind of quiet acknowledgement of what was and what wasn't, and a settled peace with both. Cole in a clean white shirt and his good dark coat was simply Cole, still, attentive, without performance. But when Eva came down the aisle in the best dress she had, which was blue and which she had let Clara Reardon press into particular neatness, Cole's expression changed in the way she had seen it change in the barn, only more so. That slow, complete opening of everything he kept closed, visible to anyone who was looking, which was everyone in that church. The ceremony was simple and the minister's voice was dry but kind, and when he reached the part about what Cole was taking on a wife, a home, a shared life, Cole said, "I do," with the same quiet completeness with which he did everything, and Eva said the same two words and felt the full, anchored weight of them. They kissed briefly and chastely in front of 30 Harrow Creek residents and the minister, and then they walked back down the aisle together through a shower of dried flower petals that Mrs. Halbert had organized, and into the bright March sun. The first year of their marriage was a year of learning each other in all the intimate, particular ways that no courtship allows. They learned each other's rhythms, that Cole woke before dawn as a matter of deeply set habit, that Eva was sharpest in the mornings before the day's business crowded in, that Cole made decisions slowly and then kept them absolutely, that Eva approached problems from angles, circling, and that between these two approaches they rarely came to the same conclusion by the same road but almost always arrived at the same place. They disagreed sometimes. Cole had fixed ideas about how the ranch should be managed that occasionally bumped against Eva's newer observations, and she was not a woman who smoothed over her opinions to preserve domestic peace. He listened to her always with that quality of full attention, and he pushed back sometimes in that quiet, immovable way he had, and they worked through it at the kitchen table or on the porch in the evenings, and neither of them held onto grievances, which helped enormously. Eva learned to ride properly, Seth taught her, on Saturday mornings, with the patient thoroughness of someone who loved horses and wanted other people to love them correctly. By summer she could work a horse well enough to ride out to the far paddocks on her own, which gave her a freedom she had not anticipated and valued more than she could easily explain. She also learned to shoot. Cole taught her this himself, one afternoon in the scrubland, setting up tin cans on a fence rail with the same deliberate care he brought to everything. He stood behind her to correct her stance, his hands adjusting her position with a matter-of-fact steadiness, and she felt the whole length of him solid behind her and was profoundly aware of his proximity in a way that made her first 2 shots go wide and her third one knock the can off the rail and Cole say, very quietly at her ear, "There it is," and she could feel him smiling. The territory was not always peaceful. There were disputes over water rights between neighboring ranches that winter, a long-running tension that ran along the lines of old cattle country resentments, and the Townsend ranch was not entirely outside it. A man named Harlan Prout, who owned the spread to the east, had been pushing for access to the creek water in dry months in ways that the Townsends considered overreaching. Cole handled it with his characteristic patience and firmness, meeting with Prout and the local land agent in a Harrow Creek saloon, and emerging with a written agreement that gave Prout seasonal access to certain portions of the creek and the Townsends certain assurances about their own usage, and which both men signed without further drama. Eva asked him afterward how he had managed Prout, who had a reputation for being difficult. "I let him talk until he was finished," Cole said. "Most men just want to be heard. After that they are more reasonable." She looked at him. "Is that what you do with me?" He looked back at her with that almost smile. "With you I listen because you are saying something worth listening to. With Prout I listened because it was cheaper than fighting." She laughed, and he caught the sound of it with the same quiet, satisfied quality he always had when she laughed, as though storing it. In the autumn of 1880 she told him she was expecting their first child, sitting at the kitchen table in the morning light with her hands folded and watching his face. Cole was still for one full, held breath, and then the careful distance he maintained between himself and the most significant things vanished completely, and he crossed the kitchen and took her face in his hands and kissed her with a feeling that needed no words at all. Margaret, informed that same evening, sat down in her chair and was quiet for such a long, uncharacteristic moment that Eva began to worry. Then Margaret said, in a voice that was unusually rough, "Your father would have been glad to know this." Eva felt the weight of that, the presence of Harding Langston in this moment he had engineered from the distance of his own dying, and the simple, piercing wish that he could have seen it. "He would have liked Cole," she said. "Of course he would have," Margaret said. "He knew what he was sending you to." Seth and Clara Reardon were married that same autumn in October, in a ceremony twice the size of Cole and Eva's, with Clara's enormous extended family filling every pew and overflowing into the churchyard. Seth at the altar was incandescent with happiness in a way that made half the congregation smile reflexively, and Clara looked at him as though he were the most convenient and wonderful thing she had ever arranged in her life. Nate had taken on a new hand that summer, a quiet young man from the Texas border named Aurelio Ruiz, who was excellent with cattle and who turned out to have an equal love of books. By September, Nate and Aurelio could be found most evenings in the barn or on the bunkhouse step in deep, animated conversation about whatever Nate had most recently been reading. Eva noticed this with a quiet, warm satisfaction that she shared with Cole one evening. "Nate has found someone to talk to," she said. Cole, who had also noticed, said, "About time." Spring of 1881 brought the baby, a boy born on a Tuesday morning in April, with Cole's dark eyes and Eva's stubborn jaw, healthy and loud and entirely consuming of everyone's attention for the first weeks of his life. Cole held his son for the first time in the small room at the back of the house, the room that had been Eva's when she first arrived, which they had made into a nursery, and his face did the thing it did, open completely, all the carefulness gone, raw and full and real. "What will we call him?" Eva asked from the bed, watching. Cole looked at her over the baby's head. "What do you want?" She had been thinking about this. "Harding," she said, "for my father." Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once the way he nodded when he had made a decision. "Harding Cole Townsend," he said. The baby, perhaps recognizing the authority in his father's voice, stopped crying and blinked at him. "He knows his name already," Eva said. "He is our son," Cole said simply. "Of course he does." The months that followed had the quality of the particular exhaustion and joy of new parenthood, which Eva and Cole navigated in their respective ways. Eva with the practical adaptability of a woman who had been managing difficulty since childhood. Cole with the steady, inexhaustible patience of a man who simply decided what was required and did it without complaint. He was the one who got up at 3 in the morning without being asked, because he was awake anyway, and Eva would hear him in the nursery talking to Harding in a low, continuous voice about the ranch, the horses, the particulars of cattle breeding, as though the baby were an intelligent adult who might appreciate the specifics. She lay in the dark and listened to Cole's voice moving through the wall and thought that she had never in her life felt so placed, so correctly positioned in the world, as she did in this house on this ranch at the foot of these red hills. In the summer of 1881, there was an incident that reminded everyone briefly that the territory was not yet entirely settled. A group of riders, not cattle thieves this time, but something more organized. Men working on behalf of a land speculation company from the East that had been buying up range titles through questionable means, came to the Townsend ranch with a piece of paper and a lawyer's manner, and the suggestion that the Townsend water rights were in dispute. This was not a random inconvenience. It was part of a pattern that had been affecting smaller ranches across the territory. Eva had learned from Margaret, who read the territorial newspaper with close attention. Eastern Capital was moving into the New Mexico territory in the wake of the railroad, and land that had been held by working ranchers for decades was being challenged through the manipulation of old Spanish land grant records and the replacement of territorial courts with officials more sympathetic to investment interests. Cole read the paper they brought with the same still attention he brought to everything, and then he looked up at the two men who had delivered it and said, "I will need to consult my attorney in Santa Fe." "Of course," the lawyer type said smoothly. "In the meantime," Cole said, in a tone that had gone quiet in a specific way that Eva had learned to recognize as meaning he was very serious, "you are on private land. I will ask you to go." Nate, who had appeared at the barn door during this exchange, was watching with his arms folded. Seth was visible at the corral gate. The men looked at the three Townsend brothers and at the document they had clearly assumed would be more immediately effective, and they went. Cole spent 2 days writing letters to the land attorney in Santa Fe, to other ranchers in the territory who had received similar papers, to the territorial legislature's land committee, whose existence he had learned about through Nate's newspaper reading. Eva sat with him at the kitchen table on the second evening while Harding slept, helping him organize the correspondence and reading the land documents closely herself, and found in the old Spanish grant records a discrepancy in the survey points that made the speculator company's claim considerably weaker than it appeared. Cole looked at her when she showed him. "How did you find that?" he said. "My father was a surveyor," she said. "I grew up reading land descriptions." He looked at her for a moment with the particular expression she had come to know as his version of being moved by something. Then he took her hand across the table and held it and said nothing, because with Cole, silence was often the fullest thing. The land challenge was ultimately dismissed by the Santa Fe court the following spring, the Townsend case being one of several that collectively demonstrated a pattern of fraudulent survey documentation. The speculator company retreated to look for easier prey elsewhere, and the Townsend water rights were confirmed and recorded in a form that would be harder to challenge going forward. Eva received a small formal acknowledgement in the court's correspondence, listed as having contributed relevant survey analysis to the supporting evidence, and thought of her father with a gratitude that had moved, over time, from grief into something warmer and more sustaining. Life on the ranch settled back into its rhythms. Harding grew from a loud, demanding infant into a loud, demanding toddler of very specific opinions, particularly about horses, which he had inherited from Seth by proximity, and which Seth encouraged enthusiastically. By the spring of 1882, when Harding was 11 months old and pulling himself up on every available surface with alarming determination, Eva found herself watching him with a love so acute it sometimes felt like pain. Clara and Seth had their own news by that spring. A baby was coming. Clara told Eva over coffee in the kitchen with a happiness that was entirely Clara's particular brand, warm and merry, and completely without anxiety. Their son arrived in July, and Seth named him James, and the two cousins, born less than a year apart, would become the cause of an enormous amount of noise and motion on the Townsend ranch for years to come. Nate and Aurelio had, by 1882, become something that did not have a common or simple name in the territory's vocabulary, but which Margaret had acknowledged once with a brief, thoughtful silence, and then a plain statement that Aurelio was welcome at the family table, and she hoped he would stay, and which Cole had acknowledged not in words, but in the specific, practical way he had of making someone part of the working life of the ranch in a way that meant you were part of the family. Aurelio stayed. The cattle operation expanded to the Cimarron as Nate had planned, and the two of them ran it together with a precision and a dedication that made the Townsend cattle business the most successful element of the ranch by 1883. Eva and Cole had their second child in the spring of that year, another boy, darker than Harding, with Eva's brown hair and Cole's jaw, and a disposition of such placid good humor that the household found him a relief after Harding's relentless energy. They named him Daniel, for Cole's father, whose name had been Daniel Owen Townsend the Elder, the origin of the whole complicated naming tradition that had brought Eva to a train platform with a name and no other directions. Cole told her this one evening about his father, whose shadow had been on everything in this house from the beginning, who had made the promise to Harding Langston, who had given all his sons the same middle name out of some conviction that it would hold them together, which in a roundabout way it had. "He sounds like a man with a plan," Eva said. "He had plans," Cole agreed. "Not all of them made obvious sense at the time." She looked at him across the kitchen table, with Daniel asleep in his cradle in the corner, and Harding audible somewhere upstairs, negotiating loudly with Margaret about bedtime. Cole was reading a land management pamphlet by lamplight, his reading glasses, a relatively new edition, to which he had submitted with minimal complaint, perched on his nose, his big rancher's hands spread flat on either side of the pamphlet. She thought about the train platform. The three men in a row with their dark eyes and their identical surprise. The way she had stood there with her carpetbag and her father's letter and absolutely no map. She thought about standing in the barn with Cole's hand in hers for the first time in that long bar of pale light, and the slow opening of his face when he stopped being careful. She thought about all the things her father had known and had not said, and the extraordinary thing it was that he had been right. "Cole," she said. He looked up over the reading glasses. "I want to tell you something," she said. He set the pamphlet down and took the glasses off and gave her his full attention, the way he always did. "I was so angry with him," she said carefully. "When he died, when I read that letter, I was so angry that he had not told me more, had not given me more to work with, just a name." She paused, "But he gave me exactly the right thing." Cole looked at her. "He gave me enough to find you," she said. "That was all I needed." Cole was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and took her hand the same way he always took her hand, unhurried, entirely right, and said, "I think he knew I would be the one to find you back." She smiled. He kept her hand. In the years that followed, through the expanding of the cattle operation and the growth of the horse breeding program, and the years of raising Harding and Daniel, and the third child who arrived in 1885, a girl they named Clara Margaret Townsend, after two women of considerable consequence, who arrived with her mother's stubbornness already in full operation, and her father's eyes, the Townsend ranch became something different from what it had been when Eva arrived with her carpetbag. It was not different in the physical sense, or not only. The land was the same land, the red hills the same red hills, the dry creek running in the spring as it always had. The horses still moved in the corrals at dawn, and the cattle were still on the range, and the kitchen still smelled of wood smoke, and Margaret still sat at the head of the table, with the authority of someone who knew exactly what everything in her range of vision was worth. But there were more voices in it now, more feet on the floorboards, more opinions at the table, more laughter in the yard. Seth and Clara and young James were a constant presence. Seth coming over most days on some pretext of ranch business that always involved a meal and an argument and someone going home late. Nate and Aurelio rode in from the southern operation on weekends, bringing news of the cattle market and fresh reading material, and increasingly, a settled contentment that did not require explanation. Mrs. Halbert at the Mercantile had long since given up trying to extract useful social information from the Townsend family, and had instead resigned herself to friendly relations. Deputy Cruz had grown into an adequate lawman and had been promoted to sheriff. The territorial politics remained complicated. The tension between large and small land interests an ongoing feature of life that required constant vigilance. But the Townsend ranch had established itself firmly enough, with solid enough documentation, to be a harder target than many. Eva had become, without entirely planning to, something of a resource in the territory for the kind of careful reading of land documents that had helped win the water rights case. 3 neighboring ranchers had brought her their paperwork over the years, with the kind of delicate embarrassment of people asking for a thing they cannot quite name, and she had sat with each of them at the kitchen table and found what needed finding, and sent them to the Santa Fe attorney with better information than they had arrived with. It was not the life she had planned, but then she had arrived here with no plan beyond a name, and this seemed, in every way that mattered, to be better than whatever plan she might have made. One evening in the spring of 1887, when Harding was 6 and Daniel was 4 and little Clara Margaret was 2, and had recently discovered the pleasure of attempting to ride the most patient of the horses bareback with both hands buried in its mane, Eva was on the porch in the last light while Cole finished up at the barn. The hills were going the particular deep rose they went at evening, and the air had the spring smell of desert bloom, faint and sweet and medicinal. Cole came across the yard, settling his hat back on his head, and came up the steps and sat beside her. He was 40 years old now, though he looked it only in the crow's feet at the corners of his eyes and the gray that had come into his hair at the temples, which Eva privately found very distinguished and had told him so, which had made him look at her in the way he had that she could never entirely describe, somewhere between disbelief and deep pleasure. She had been thinking, sitting there, about the letter, about the train, about the platform and the 3 dark-eyed men in a row. "What are you thinking?" Cole asked. "I was thinking about when I arrived," she said. He was quiet a moment. "What part?" "The platform," she said. "You all standing there, you all had the same look." "What look?" "Like men who had been handed something unexpected and were trying to decide what to do with it." He almost smiled. "That is a fair description. You had the most controlled version of it," she said. "Seth looked like he might say something impetuous. Nate looked like he was already categorizing me. You just looked." She paused. "You looked like you were already making a decision about something." "I was," he said. She looked at him. "What were you deciding?" He was quiet for a moment, in the old way, the careful way, but with the warmth in it now that had replaced the distance. "I was deciding," he said, "whether I would let myself want what I already wanted." Eva looked at him for a long moment. The light was on his face, that evening desert rose, and his dark eyes were steady and full and entirely hers. "What did you decide?" she said, though she knew. "I decided," he said, "that my father owed a debt and debts are paid in full." He paused. "And then I decided that had nothing to do with it." She reached for his hand and he took it, the way he had 100 times, 1,000 times, with the same unhurried, exactly right quality that had been there from the very first time in the barn. She folded her fingers through his and leaned her head against his shoulder and looked at the pink hills going deep red in the fading light. Inside the house, Harding's voice rose in some complaint and Daniel's voice rose in some counterargument, and Clara Margaret's voice rose above both of them with the particular carrying power of a 2-year-old who has decided she needs an audience. And Margaret's calm, authoritative voice could be heard sorting it all out with the efficiency of a woman who had been managing Townsend men for 30 years and found a new generation no particular surprise. From somewhere across the yard came the sound of Seth's horse. He was here for supper, as he was most evenings, and Seth's voice calling something to the horse in the fond, one-sided way he spoke to all horses. Cole's thumb moved in a slow arc across her knuckles. "Do you ever think about what would have happened," she said, "if you had told your brothers about the letter before I arrived?" "Yes," he said, and I think Seth would have been on that platform alone, and he would have said something very warm and a little bit impetuous, and you would have felt warmly about him." He paused. "And I think I would have spent several years being very politely in the background about it." She laughed. "You would have let him." "I was trying to," he said honestly. "He wanted it and I was not certain you would." He stopped. "You were not certain I would choose you," she said. "No," he said simply. She lifted her head from his shoulder to look at him. He met her eyes. "Cole," she said. "Yes." There was never a question. She said it quietly and she said it completely and she meant it with everything. "From the moment you held my hand in that barn, there was never any question." Something moved through his face, the old opening, the slow completeness of it, and he said nothing. Because with Cole some things were too large for words, but he brought their joined hands up and pressed his mouth to the back of hers, and held it there for a moment in the fading light, and that was everything. In 1889, New Mexico Territory was still 10 years from statehood, still a place of red dust and open range, and the complicated, layered inheritance of Spanish land grants and Apache territory, and the relentless press of American expansion and settlement that had reshaped everything for everyone. Not all of it justly, not all of it cleanly, but ongoing and irrevocable nonetheless. The Townsend Ranch sat in the middle of all this history with its feet planted and its water rights documented and 3 generations of energy invested in its ground, and it endured. Harding, at 8, was his father entirely, not in personality, which was louder and more sociable, but in the quality of his attention to the ranch, the horses, the land. He followed Cole everywhere with the devotion of a good dog and the inconvenient tendency of an intelligent child to ask questions that required real answers. Cole answered all of them with patience and precision, and Eva watched them move through the corrals together in the morning light, and felt the same acute love that was sometimes nearly pain. Daniel was quiet where Harding was loud, dreamy where Harding was focused, and had developed, with no instruction from anyone, a habit of sitting with Nate during his visits and reading from whatever book Nate had most recently brought, in the same absorbed, parallel silence of 2 people who find the presence of each other an enhancement to their own thought. Nate had taken to bringing books specifically for Daniel, which made Harding vaguely put out and Daniel quietly radiant. Clara Margaret, now 4, had confirmed her initial presenting personality entirely. She had opinions about horses, about food, about the arrangement of things in the kitchen, about the correct order in which bedtime events should occur, and she delivered all these opinions with her father's absolute calm and her mother's complete certainty, which was an extremely effective combination, and which made Seth laugh until he had to hold the fence. Seth and Clara's son James was 9 now, and had become Harding's best friend and constant co-conspirator in the particular projects of active boys, most of which involved horses, some of which involved the creek bed, and a memorable few of which had required multiple adults to resolve. Clara Reardon Townsend managed her son and her husband with the same merry, unflappable good humor she had managed everything else, and Eva loved her as a sister. The winter of 1889 was one of the cold ones, the kind of winter the territory could produce, a sustained freeze that came down from the northern mountains and settled over the range for weeks, killing some of the brush and making the water troughs ice over before dawn. The cattle had to be brought in from the far range, and there was a week of hard work in the cold that left everyone exhausted and slightly short-tempered, and which Cole handled with the same steady, unfussy competence with which he had always handled hard things. Eva was, that winter, expecting their 4th child, which the family doctor in Harrow Creek had confirmed in October. She was 32 years old, and this was not her first difficult winter, and she was not the kind of woman who accepted confinement without protest, but she did accept Cole's insistence that she not ride out in the deep cold, because she recognized in that insistence the particular quality of his worry, which was always quiet and always real. She stayed in the house and managed the domestic side of the cold weather operation, and kept the kitchen running and organized the correspondence for the water committee she had been serving on since the Wrights case, and argued with Harding about his education and read to Daniel in the evenings, and received Clara Margaret's opinions about the correct placement of the pine boughs they used as winter decoration with the gravity they deserved. Cole came in every evening from the cold with ice in his beard and the smell of horses and cold air on his coat, and she helped him out of it and fed him and sat with him by the fire, and whatever had been hard about the day became easier in the warmth of that kitchen. And she thought every time how extraordinary it was that a dying man's whispered name and a train ticket and $4.32 had brought her here to this. The fourth child was a boy, born in March of 1890, as the last of the winter cold was breaking, and the first pale green was showing on the scrub below the hills. They named him Owen, the first Owen among the Townsend grandchildren, fitting and full circle, a name that had made so much possible. Cole held his youngest son and looked at Eva over the baby's head with those dark eyes that had held her since the beginning and said, "Owen, Owen," she agreed. He sat beside her on the edge of the bed with the baby between them and put his arm around her. And outside the window the territory was coming back to life, the desert bloom starting up its faint, medicinal sweetness, the hills going from winter brown to the first tentative greens, and the sky above Harrow Creek, New Mexico territory, was the kind of blue that had no ceiling. Margaret came in that afternoon and looked at Owen and at her son and at Eva, and said, with the dry pragmatism that had never abandoned her through all of it, "Your father would have been insufferably pleased with himself." Eva laughed and felt the truth of it, Harding Langston, in whatever came after the lamplight of a Kansas City boarding house, watching his daughter in a house full of children and a husband who loved her and a ranch rooted in red New Mexico earth, seeing exactly what he had intended. She thought about the name on the letter, Owen Townsend, written in her father's careful hand as though it were the simplest direction in the world, which it had been, for someone who knew where it led. She thought about 3 men on a platform in the October dust, and the precise weight of a hand holding hers for the first time, and a barn full of pale morning light, and a slow smile she had worked to earn and would never stop being glad of. She thought about all the things that had resolved themselves out of that one name brothers found and settled, debts paid in the richest possible currency, land defended and held, children come into a world with a solid foundation under them, 2 people who had found in each other not just partnership, but the particular, irreplaceable thing that makes a life feel inhabited all the way to its edges. Outside, Harding's voice and James Townsend's voice rose together in some excited announcement, and Seth's voice responded with encouragement, and Clara Margaret's carrying soprano cut through all of them demanding to know what was happening, and Daniel's quieter voice could be heard providing a measured account of events, and the whole texture of the afternoon was full and warm and contained. Cole's arm was solid around her. Baby Owen was asleep between them with his small fists curled. Eva Langston Townsend looked at the ceiling of the room that had once been hers alone, the room where she had lain her first night in this strange place with nothing but a name and her father's faith, and thought, here it is. Everything that name was worth, everything it was meant for, all of it exactly right.